Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us today, and welcome to today's webinar, which is titled Investors for Affordable Cities. My name is Anthony Shine. I'm the Director of Shareholder Advocacy here at Share, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. I'm joining you today from my home, which is in East Toronto, and I'm located on traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Chippewa nations. And Toronto continues to be home to many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples. This is always a bit different on a Zoom call because, of course, we're joining from many different territories across the world. But wherever you're joining us from today, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect and acknowledge the enduring presence of Indigenous people in this land. And it's certainly a privilege to be able to live and work here where I am in Toronto, and I'm sure where you are as well. I do have just a few quick housekeeping pieces before we get into it. So I'll run through those and then we'll get into the content for today. So today's session is being recorded and some segments of it will be posted online. I believe we'll cut out the Q&A, but all of the panelists' presentations will be available later on. Closed captioning is available as well, and you can activate that using your Zoom controls. We will have time today for some audience Q&A. So if you have questions for the panel or for Tamara about the paper that was released earlier today, you can put those into the Q&A function on the chat, and we'll come to those at the end. I'm going to read this part fast. It's the legal disclaimer here, so forgive me. Today's webinar is for informational purposes only, and it is not and should not be regarded as financial advice, investment advice, trading advice, or any other advice, or as a recommendation regarding any particular investment, security, or course of action. This information is provided with the understanding that participants will make their own independent decisions with respect to any course of action and to whether such course of action is appropriate or proper based on their own judgment. So with that said, it won't come as a surprise to any of us that Canada has been facing a housing crisis. Over the course of the federal election that wrapped up earlier this summer, all of the major party leaders dedicated attention in their platforms to promises to address this crisis by building more housing, by making it cheaper to purchase or to rent, and through a flurry of tax incentives, regulatory changes, and subsidies. Throughout the pandemic, communities across the country, from small cities, major urban centers, have seen wild spikes in home purchase and rent prices, demand across the board, as well as waves of eviction and homelessness. But this is not a new crisis, and like most of the more thorny issues that we deal with, it didn't appear out of thin air. It's the result of decades of policy choices. So we have a fantastic panel today of leading experts and activists and advocates on housing and housing policy. And we'll be talking both about the scope of the current crisis and how investors have already been involved in shaping today's situation. And of course, what a better future can look like. That's sort of the share way, is to get towards the action as much as we can. So I want to thank the Vancouver Foundation and the Catherine Donnelly Foundation for their generous support of this project and today's presentation. I know there's representatives from both foundations with us, so thank you so much for your ongoing support. Over the course of the discussion today, I hope that you'll develop a pretty clear understanding of a few things. So first, of the state of the housing affordability crisis in Canada and why this is a relevant issue to investors and to people in various fiduciary roles. I hope we'll develop a clear understanding of what financialization of housing really means and the role that institutional investors have played as actors in this space in North America over the last number of years. And finally, we'll start to discuss some of the pathways or identified actions that are possible for a more positive role for investors that Share has presented in a paper that was released earlier today. So I'll just quickly introduce our panel now. First up, we'll hear from Alejandra Ruiz Vargas, who is a frontline housing worker and a national leader with Acorn Canada. Acorn, as many of you may know, is an independent national organization for low and moderate income people with 140,000 members in, I think, 24 chapters in cities across the country. We'll also be joined by Professor Martine August, assistant professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo, and a leading expert on housing financialization, among many other issues, but that'll be the focus of today's discussion. And then third, I'll be joined by Leilani Farah, who is the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing and Global Director of The Shift. And then as we wrap things up towards the end of today's session, we'll hear from my colleague, Tamara Herman, who is the manager of North American Capital Strategies at Share and the lead author of the new paper that I hope most of you have at least opened, if not completely digested. It was emailed to you earlier today. we're very pleased and excited about that paper that was released earlier today. So as I mentioned, we'll have some time at a couple points throughout the session for audience Q&A. So you can type your questions into the chat, and we will try and put them to the panel as time goes on. So I do want to start with you, Alejandra. I know you have some slides that you're going to share with us. I really want to just frame your remarks a little bit by referring to some of the pieces that Tamara outlines in the paper. So Acorn really has a firsthand view of the housing crisis, and I know you do through your work. And in the paper today, Tamara described how some of the what are referred to as value add and opportunistic strategies that financialized landlords have used, and how they've affected affected tenants across Canada. So we're really hoping that you can put paint that picture for us a little bit, give us a clear view of what that looks like, as well as perhaps how Acorn has been involved in fighting back against some of those more predatory kinds of practices. So I'll turn it over to you, and we'll get your slides up on the screen here.
Thank you so much, Anthony. So hello, everybody. This is a great opportunity to be here. Thank you for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to show what is happening really in the grounds. So, so can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Even though Anthony mentioned something about what is Acorn, I would like to mention too that we are 24 we have 24 chapters across the Canada, and we are 140,000 members. And well, our key priorities is that we want to organize for change. We are low income and moderate income people, and we want to give leadership and of course empowering. And we are a multi-issue organization. And this is very important because number and peoples are power. Can we please pass it to the next slide? Thank you. So the problem is 40% of Canadians right now, renters, they spend more than 30% in rent in utilities. And then 18% of Canadians rent more, like 50% or more in rent and utilities. So that means that 1.8 million households, they are living in crowd, like overcrowd conditions, without no repairs, with and the most important thing, is extremely important, is they are unaffordable. And the other thing is right now, tenants, we are in fear because there are renovictions, there are demo evictions. There are, so we live in fear, and every time somebody knocks at the door and leave a note that we know it's from the landlord, we don't know what is going to happen. So, and plus the threat that there are big, some rent increases, even though when it has been said, the no rent increases, isn't it? Because here in Ontario, this was the law in 2020. So we can put the other slide, please. So these pictures are not made it up. They are real, unfortunately. This is how many people across Canada live. And it's not because the tenants did it. It's because let's focus on the picture in the middle, and you will see that it was a little leak and now become huge. And then in the third picture, you will see is unbelievable, the lack of repairs. And one thing that is important, extremely important to note, is that Acorn members and tenants across Canada, they have to do difficult decisions, isn't it? They have to choose, or they pay rent, or they do buy groceries, or they afford, let's say, internet. So, so we are in a very tough situation right now. We're in a very tough moment, and I'm going to explain you why this is important to show this. So next slide, please. Thank you. So again, more maintenance, and look at the amount of cockroach that Acorn member has. in a time. So we did a survey, and in this survey we found, we call it the stereo report in 2020. And this is what we found, like 41% of roaches or other bugs that are in households and in apartments. Security issues, 33%. The garbage tester wells are very unclean, 25%. Garbage chutes and are unclean and has odors and of course more bugs, 21.8%. And the hallways are disgusting in many cases, well, 21%. And here you can see a little example that people seen everyday cockroach, and it's like 22%. So next please slide. So this is why what was very important to show what is happening with the repairs, because are the tactics that landlords, big landlords are doing. So the landlords trying to extract so much money, the much money that they can from tenants, and plus they don't do repairs simply because we are very unprotected, meaning the tenants. So it's no rent control or minimal rent control, it's no caps of the rent. So basically when somebody moves, the landlord knows that they can double the rent. And the other thing that we had observed, and of course, what is happening is when you live in a place that is no repairs, you pay your rent, no repairs, you call, it's no pest control, is very minimal what they do for you. Well, you get fed up and you try to look for another place. And this is what the landlords are doing. So when you move, they know that they can double the rent, and they double the rent. And now what is happening as well is that there are the bidding. So people has been applying for rental, and the landlords are still then, okay, so what you can do more, because I had 20 people ahead you, and I looking for the best that they're going to give me. What about 6 months of rent ahead? And people has been to put up with that. And of course, this is not right. And we are very concerned. And this should not be happening in a country that had so much money. So next slide, please. So now I want to present it to you, the REITs. These are the big landlords. And they are, like, for example, they are making 9 out of 10 of the biggest landlords in Canada. And plus, well, we cannot blame only the REITs, because there are other large corporations or landlords that are doing the same. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the other thing that is a problem is the evictions. They know that when they renovate, they can put the rent even higher or double. And plus, this is what I was telling before, even the rent freeze was in effect, they still putting the rent higher. The other thing is what I was saying, tenants are so fed up, they try to look for another place. And the landlords, the big landlords love it, isn't it? This is a way to make people move. And the other thing that is very concerning, and we saw a lot over the pandemic, is the above the guideline increases. It's a loophole that the Tenancy Act has. And well, it's very concerning, because this is something that should not be even happening, because they don't have even kept the apartment buildings well. So how are they going to increase more rent? They had already enough. So next slide. Coming back to about the guideline increases, because it has been something very difficult for tenants to find out that they lost their jobs, and plus now they're going to receive above the guideline increases. And I would like that we read together, of course, in your mind, you want, what it says. Capri, that is one of the biggest REITs in Canada, says a management continues to pursue applications in Ontario for AGIs where EV increases above the annual guidelines are supported by market conditions to raise monthly rents on lease renewals. I imagine the person who put this release is very happy, and the people are very happy, the people that are from Capri. But I'm going to tell you that this is obscene. This is immoral. This should not be happening. And I don't see so. And or at least in our books and ACOR books, profit should never be before than lives. And we had here an example, because I'm going to finish. I know I think so past the 7 minutes, is that in Main Square, this is which is your building. They had an AGIs that were illegal. What does mean? They try to fish people. They serve the AGIs, but the landlord board tenant board, it wasn't. They didn't say yes to the about the guideline increases. So that means that they are doing illegal things or trying to fish, try to fish who can pay. So ACON was there and was telling to the tenants that they don't need to pay unless the landlord board tenant serve them with a form that say, yes, you need to pay. So some people already pay. It was really sad because now the rent is even higher than what they have. And Capri, again, feel close to 500 evictions applications. There should be a change. And I see, so I passed the 7 minutes.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask you to follow up on one piece. So I think you've really demonstrated really clearly what some of the issues are in some of the, or many of the buildings where Acorn has members, and many other buildings across Canada, particularly with the larger financialized landlords. But I did want to give you a chance to tell us a bit about what Acorn's advocacy and organizing looks like. Pretty different from the kinds of work that most of the investors on today's call will be able to make use of. But certainly you've had some successful campaigns and a lot of organizing around this. So if you can just tell us a bit about that.
Yes, well, what we have been doing is educating people, and we have been requested to the federal government that they need to take this ability that the REITs has, that they don't pay taxes, corporate taxes, taxes are needed. And right now we are in a pandemic and we need to recovery, and this will be awesome if we can request the REITs for taxes. And with these taxes, we should be doing more social housing and more co-ops. And plus, the other thing that we have been doing is stopping landlords to be given money. Like, for example, in Hamilton, happens that there are a big corporation that wanted to demolish building and demolish a lot of people. And ACOR, with their advocacy, we stopped them to do it. And plus, we stopped the city to give money to big developers. So we need rent control. This is other thing that ACON has been pounding to all officials, especially here in Ontario, because we need rent control. And this will help a lot immensely to problems that we see here and that are arising. So we have been doing a big campaign about it. And hopefully with the next election, we can see some changes.
That's great. Thanks for summarizing that. So you've got both direct tenant action in many buildings, as well as some really clear public policy asks around rent control and around tax treatment for REITs. So I want to bring in Martine at this point, and we'll come back to you a bit later on, Alejandra, to hear a bit more about your research. Thank you so much, and we'll be back with you soon. So Martine, I think you're with us again on the screen. Yes, there you are. So Alejandra really described some of the practices that financialized landlords use: rent evictions, dem evictions, some good portmanteaus there, and really aggressive rent increases. And I know those are practices that you've documented in your research and publications, particularly how some of the landlords that we're talking about here actually brag about some of those practices. Can you maybe just tell us a bit more about that, what you've documented in your own research? And I think we have a slide with some good quotes that you've pulled out there that we'll get up on the screen for you.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So in my research, I've looked at the practices of financial firms that acquire multifamily housing. This includes REITs, real estate investment trusts, but also other types of financial firms. So Anthony, you used the term financialized landlords. I include in that category publicly listed real estate companies, private equity, institutional investors like pension funds, insurance companies, and asset managers. And my research argues that the business strategies of financial firms are harmful to tenants. In order to drive greater value for investors, these firms are motivated to prioritize profits. And they've got the scale and capital and sophistication to do this in ways that are more systematic and aggressive than smaller operators. So basically, this can be done by either lowering expenses or increasing revenues. So it's pretty simple. And in general, firms call it repositioning a building to make it more profitable for investors. So when a financial firm buys a building, maybe they've got tenants in it who are paying low rents, and then they invest in repositioning and try to extract more income from the building and the people living there, and then share that income with shareholders. So when we look at lowering expenses, can be done by investing in energy efficiency upgrades, capitalizing on economies of scale, but also by cutting down on maintenance and upkeep in some cases, or firing superintendents and then renting out their suite. So these are the types of things that tenants discuss. And sometimes tenants will see their own units, long-term tenants will see their own units getting neglected in some of the ways that Alejandra described, even as the building around them is getting upgraded and renovated for people who can pay more. So that kind of moves to the next strategy, which is around raising revenues. So the biggest gains come from raising revenues, and this ultimately comes from the pockets of tenants. So firms raise revenues in a couple ways. One is that they try to monetize everything. So charging for things that formerly hadn't been costs that tenants paid, or increasing those. So laundry, parking, using the party room, using storage lockers, sub-metering utilities so that people will pay utility costs instead of having that included in rents, raising fees on all of these types of things. So I've learned a lot about this from going to landlord conferences. I was at one where the owner of a REIT asked another in the Q&A, can you monetize life security? And this actually wasn't a joke. So really monetizing everything is one strategy. And of course, the big strategy is raising rents. You can raise rents kind of in three ways. First of all, firms can raise rents on existing tenants, sitting tenants, by systematically applying for guideline rent increases. Also, as Alejandra mentioned, these firms are strategic in applying for above guideline increases. So these are increases that allow for higher rent increases above the cost of living when firms invest strategically in certain major capital repairs, which can make them eligible then to charge those costs back onto tenants. And I'll remind you of that quote that Alejandra put up on the screen, where CAPREIT said that this is a revenue generation strategy. It's not a way to make the company whole for these expenses that they can't afford. It's strategically done to raise revenues and then share those with investors. And then the biggest gains come from pursuing vacancies. So we've got vacancy decontrol in the province of Ontario, and many other provinces have this too. What this means is that when a unit becomes vacant, landlords can raise the rent by any amount. So they're not limited to raising it only once per year by the cost of living, the guideline increase as it's called. And so financial firms are really fixated on achieving what they call unit turnovers, trying to remove people who are paying low rents and then jacking up those rents upon vacancy. And this is really a particularly appealing strategy in areas facing gentrification pressures, particularly in buildings where you have lots of people who've been there for a long time who are paying low rents. If firms can get those people out, then they can invest in renovations, repositioning the building for a luxury renter, and really increase those rents a lot. So driving gentrification across the building and then across the community. So I've got a quote here from Daniel Drimmer. He's the CEO of Starlight Investments. This is the biggest landlord in the country. Starlight owns 60,000 suites. And he explained it this way. He said, the money and returns for his company are made in the suites when the suites turn over. So pursuing turnovers, trying to get tenants out of units so that the rents can be maximally raised. This is just a key strategy of financial firms. It's pretty simple. So ultimately, I say that the business strategy of these firms is based on tenant displacement and dispossession. Their actions are exacerbating patterns of gentrification and the displacement of lower income renters. And they're also aggravating affordability crisis in many Canadian communities by pushing the rents sky high in order to deliver these returns to investors.
That's a really clear overview of those strategies. And that last one, the turnover one, always reminds me of like watching a 90s TV show where you think, how can these folks live in this beautiful Manhattan apartment? And it's always, rent control, this apartment that's been passed down through the family or something like that over many years. Of course, that's TV, but it does sort of illustrate, in my mind at least, what that incentive is to a landlord to push people who are paying controlled rents out. You've also documented like the really rapid concentration. I was really surprised by this in reading some of your recent work, just how like recent and modern a phenomenon some of this is. So I think you estimate that about 20% of private rental stock in Canada is now owned by institutional investors. I have that right. But can you tell us about how that's changed in really the last like 10, 15 years?
Sure, and I have another slide, Stephanie, if you could advance it. Financial firms began to reshape the multifamily sector in the late 1990s. So I'll ask people to just look at this top line on the slide, the green line. This shows the number of apartment suites in Canada that are owned by real estate investment trusts. So I mentioned lots of different types of financialized landlords. This is just REITs because it's easier to find their holdings online. And so what you can see here is this dramatic increase or consolidation of ownership by these types of firms. Who went from holding 0 apartments in 1996 to about 170,000 in 2019. And then, Anthony, you mentioned a 20% figure. That includes more than just REITs. So if you look at the top 25 biggest financial firms in the country, that includes REITs and other types of financial firms. They hold about 330,000 suites, and that's about 20% of the country's purpose-built multifamily housing stock. So about 1/5. And I really want to say that I think this is probably an underestimate. It's really hard to determine ownership. Not all holdings are public. There's a lot of shell companies. It's very difficult to know the full magnitude of this. So I consider the figures that I cite to be conservative underestimates. And then I think participants today would also be interested to see rising financial ownership in other areas of residential real estate as well. So I've included ownership of seniors housing here. In seniors housing, and especially in retirement living properties, we've seen an even more aggressive program of acquisition by financial firms. 42% of retirement properties in Canada are owned by financial players, according to my analysis, as are 22% of long-term care homes, which I don't have to emphasize have been in the media over the last couple of years for a lot of bad reasons. And there are similar trends in student housing as well. So we're seeing this financialization of rental housing, residential real estate in a lot of different sectors. And then I've just got one more slide to talk to this point about the growing consolidation. So this is a slide that shows multifamily properties that have been sold, that have changed hands in just Toronto over the past 50 years. So I'll ask everybody to look at the proportion of sales each year that's shaded black. That shows us the financial firms that acquired suites that year. And so what you can see in general is from the 90s onward, we're seeing the rise of acquisitions by financial firms, also by large corporate chains, which are yellow here. But if we look at the year 2020, last year, during the global pandemic, it's almost entirely financial firms who went shopping and were acquiring multifamily housing. And we can also see that the volume of transactions was quite high, approaching some of the historic highs. And this is after 2019, which was a big year for multifamily housing sales. So what we're really seeing is that increasingly financial firms are dominating in ownership. And so this matters because they're treating these homes as products for investment and then managing them to maximize investor profits. And the strategies that they use arguably are harming tenants, raising rents, increasing economic hardship, generating displacement pressure, contributing to these patterns of social and spatial inequality by pushing people out and further away from central cities, and then fueling Canada's crisis of affordability.
That's really helpful to see, and I have some follow-ups I want to ask you about some of those, but we'll maybe save that for a little bit later on, because I want to hear from Leilani at this point to get a slightly different perspective and get into the next piece of this. So Leilani, I did want to just start out with asking you a bit about this, the term financialization. I think I've asked you this question before because we keep using this term. It comes up over and over again, and you've defined it as, I think, the expanding role and unprecedented dominance of financial markets and corporations in the housing sector. But it's a term that gets tossed around so much. So I was just going to ask you just briefly to expand on that a little bit more and give us the full scope of what that looks like.
Sure. And thanks, Anthony. First of all, I want to say, I really cannot be in better company. I mean, Martin and Alejandra, the way you presented this issue so clearly, so evidence-based, really, thank you so much. You make my life and work so much easier because I can just harness what you say and say, see, this is what they say. This is their evidence. So just a huge thank you. These conversations are becoming more frequent, but they're still not frequent enough. So also thanks to Sharon, the work that Tamara has done, in particular, pulling together this incredible report that I hope everyone has a chance to look at some point. So the financialization of housing, I mean, I use a very particular definition, and I try to be purposeful in that because there are things I don't want to focus on myself in my work. So the way I view the financialization of housing is as a relatively new phenomenon. So housing has long been financialized or a commodity, and that's not actually what I'm talking about in my work. I'm really talking about a new phenomenon that emerged really as a result of the global financial crisis. Obviously, all the years leading up from the advent of neoliberalism until the global financial crisis, that all set the stage, yes. But I'm talking about the unprecedented amount of capital that really emerged really because of the global financial crisis and through the global financial crisis, and who had money and who didn't. And so the way I define financialization is where housing is used with this unprecedented amount of capital to park, grow, leverage, and hide capital. And it's where housing is not at all viewed as home, certainly not viewed as a human right, nor a place from which people can thrive and give back to their communities. So that's kind of how I look at it. We saw these institutional investors that Martin and Alejandra exposed. We saw them really go on these shopping sprees after the global financial crisis. One of the things that didn't get picked up in the two presentations, because it didn't happen in Canada, but it did happen overseas in, for example, Berlin, and it happened in Spain and Madrid, was the selling off of social housing to these actors, and then doing exactly what Alejandra and Martin said. So the same business model, but applied to social housing. And in a country like Spain, that is not dissimilar from Canada, in fact, very high levels of home ownership, very little social housing. To sell off public assets and social housing was in fact imposed by structural adjustment programs in the global financial crisis era. It was supposed to be a means of Spain getting back on its economic feet, as dictated by the regional bank in Europe. Quite despicable. Alejandra might say immoral. I might say a violation of human rights. But so that's what I'm looking at when I'm talking about financialization. Is that what you're looking for, Anthony?
Yeah, no, that's really good, because I know it's it's one of those terms that has a specific definition in this context. So it's really good to zoom in on that. So you started to talk about this a little bit, but I think Alejandra gave us the kind of Canadian perspective, and you were mentioning some of what that looks like at a global scale, but maybe you want to add a little bit to that about just the size and scope of how this has developed globally, particularly since 2008 and since the financial crisis.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to financialization. What we've talked about here is mostly the purchase by these institutional investors into multifamily dwellings. and what we might call institutional homes. For my definition, it runs further afield, and I think for Alejandra and Martine, it would too. It includes, to me, for example, the advent and the welcoming in of Airbnb and short-term rental platforms, because that fits within that definition, right? Of really purchasing, I mean, sometimes whole buildings, sometimes many floors of a condo purchased solely for Airbnb. That helps to push up the in quotes value of housing, puts pressure on the housing system, and it takes away stock. So that's an example of financialization of a different sort of kind. There is also the financialization of single family homes. We know, for example, in Canada, 1 in 5 mortgages are actually investor mortgages. So 20% of new mortgages taken out are investor mortgages. We don't know exactly how that breaks down. Is it corporates? Is it just individuals buying a second home? What does that look like? But that too becomes problematic. We did hear of a company, I think it was an asset manager. It was a fund, nevertheless, that wanted to spend $1 billion across Canada purchasing single family homes. And so their purchasing power is going to wedge out the first-time home buyer, for example. I'm going to leave that there. To talk about this on a global scale, global level, what do we see? Well, we see exactly what Alejandra and Martine said. Exactly, because capital is global, the business model is global, and this is a global pattern. And that's what's so insidious about this, because housing is a deeply personal thing, right? When I meet tenants around the world, mostly they're embarrassed and humiliated that they can't pay their rent. They can't provide housing for their families. When I tell them that this is actually systemic, and not just systemic in their city or their country, but globally, it kind of blows their mind. They suddenly realize, oh my God, I'm part of this huge thing that's way bigger than me. And that's really important, because as I said, housing is so deeply personal. And that's part of the difficulty in addressing this as a human rights issue or any issue, is for so long, housing has not been talked about it from these big zoomed out systemic structural places. And the reforms that are required are big structural. And so now that's why I'm so happy for this kind of conversation, because we're starting to move in the right direction and starting to expose what's really going on for so many renters and tenants.
Yeah, no, that's I think that is so important to just see how this is happening,
I mean,
locally and at the higher level too.
Sorry,
Right.
Anthony, I mean, I can give, just so people have a sense. So I'll give an example. I visited Zurich. I was called there by some tenants. They were living in a perfectly lovely apartment complex. Many, I don't know if people know how European apartment complexes are, but sometimes they're incredible. Like 3 sort of mid-sized towers, very human scale, a courtyard in the center where there's a place for the kids to play. This one also had a child minding, like a childcare center. It had a grocery store and a hairdresser sort of on site. It was a very lively and vibrant community. It was owned by the pension fund of the Credit Suisse Bank. And that pension fund had decided it was time to make more money on this piece of land right near the heart of Zurich, right near the city center. And they were going to demolish the buildings and rebuild much taller towers, and the rents would increase, and there was no one-for-one replacement. So the people living there were not being guaranteed that they could return to an equivalent apartment, equivalent space at equivalent rent. So, I mean, that's just one of many, many examples I could give you. The selling off of social housing, as I said, that happened in Spain, that happened in Berlin. So all eyes should be on Berlin these days, because cool things are happening there. But the whole movement toward expropriation, which is happening in Berlin right now, that comes out of the selling off of social housing by the city government, or social rents, they call them. So yes, I've seen it in Sweden. I mean, I've seen it in so many different places happening in different ways. But so the business model described by Martine and Alejandra holds globally.
Great. Well, I think I have a follow-up question I do want to ask you about, but I also just want to see if we have any audience questions here. You know, just conscious of the time as well. I know that Tamara has a presentation on the discussion paper that we released earlier today. So I want to give a chance for her to present some of that, and then also to come back to our panelists for reaction to that and some follow-up questions as well. So I think I'm just going to make a game time decision here and say I'm going to save my question for you and bring Tamara on. We'll get the slides up on the screen and get a chance to hear from her and come to this question that just showed up in the chat eventually, which is, are there any good REITs? So like, is there a way to do this in a positive way? So we'll get Tamara up here and I'll turn over the microphone to her. We'll come back to everybody else in a few minutes.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to get this presentation up here. Oops. Had that unfortunate experience of having my mouse die earlier this morning. Here we go. So thank you so much to Alejandra and Martine and Leilani. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion period when we come back in about 10 minutes, because I have some questions for you as well, if there's time. And thank you all for taking the time to join us today. So I'm here on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people in Vancouver. And I'm really pleased to be presenting this research to you. It's been made possible through the support, as Anthony mentioned, of the Vancouver Foundation and the Catherine Donnelly Foundation. And I know that many of you on this call are plan staff or fiduciaries, pension fund trustees, you work with foundations, etc. And I know that you have a difficult task in front of you. You're seeking to fulfill duties to your beneficiaries. And at the same time, you're aware of these issues in your portfolios, be it around housing, be it around environmental issues, and so forth. So what I want to do is just briefly walk you through why affordable housing is an investor issue, and then look through 2 case studies that exemplify some of what we bring out in our discussion paper around the risks that come with investment in residential real estate. And then lastly, we're going to talk through some paths for investors to change the course of housing affordability as it plays out in a portfolio. So I'll just move to the next slide. So why is housing affordability an investor issue? Well, first of all, housing is a human right. I think Leilani can't speak more than Leilani has about that. Investors have a responsibility to respect human rights, and there are international frameworks that set out what this responsibility entails. Secondly, most institutional investors have a responsible investment policy in place. They've committed somewhere to incorporating social criteria into their investment processes and policies. Increasingly, investors are looking at the implications of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG factors, beyond the company level and at the systemic level. And we're starting to see this more, albeit slowly, where climate change is concerned. And investors are now acknowledging that climate change poses risks to the systems that sustain the markets and portfolios that investors depend on. And a lot of people, there's been a lot of discussion around how the COVID-19 pandemic and racial justice movements have prompted some more discussion about systemic social risks and inequality specifically. This is backed by a growing amount of research that looks at deepening inequality and the potential that it has to negatively impact investors' portfolios through increasing financial and social system level instability, damaging and slowing economic growth, etc. In Canada, and I'll get to reputational risks in a minute, but I just want to say that in Canada, housing affordability is an inequality issue. It's driven by and it drives inequality. And this is a quote from the former president and CEO of the Canada Mortgage Corporation. And I think this chart up here really does tell the story. It shows that a homeowner's net worth grew over 9 times more than renters in the first quarter of 2021 alone. Time and time again, CMHC research has found that renters have higher levels of hardship inequality, and poverty than homeowners. And the most severe impacts, of course, are experienced by seniors living alone, women, immigrants, and urban residents. In other words, housing affordability is linked to inequality, and inequality poses a systemic risk for investors. And we can also talk to reputational risk that housing investments pose for investors. So this is a recent example. The Public Sector Pension Investment Board has been under scrutiny for a joint venture with Pretium Partners, which is a US private equity firm. And the firm was raised in a congressional investigation for seeking to evict about 1,700 renters. This was during a federal moratorium on evictions at the height of the pandemic, and a disproportionate large number of those were in majority Black counties in the US. So how does the financialization of housing contribute to unaffordability? We go into a lot more detail in the paper, but I'm just going to run through a few quick points here. First, we can say that institutional investors are allocating more to residential real estate. Martina already covered this point, so I'm not going to go into it more, other than to say that the multifamily deal volume in residential real estate went from 2.5 billion in 2009 to 11 billion in 2020. Second, and I think all three speakers already covered this, we can say that specific business practices associated with residential real estate investment strategies contribute to unaffordability quite simply by raising rents for tenants. And this happens building by building, region by region across cities. So obviously much has been said about REITs, and much of the scrutiny around the financialization of housing is really centered on REITs and and value-add and opportunistic strategies. And this has generated reputational risks in turn for investors. So I just want to talk through one example really quickly. Some of you may have heard of the Parkdale rent strike. Parkdale is a historically working class, low income and racialized neighborhood near downtown Toronto. One of the largest landlords is a property management company called Metcalf, and it owns about 2 billion in assets. AIMCO, which is a Crown corporation that was established to manage investments for public pensions in Alberta, co-owns 14 of these buildings in Parkdale. So in 2017, 1,200 tenants in some of these buildings declared a rent strike to oppose the landlord's applications for above guideline rent increases. And they alleged that it had failed to perform necessary maintenance over the years. The striking tenants began receiving eviction notices, and the Parkdale rent strike just grew and amplified. And importantly, it was highly organized, and it specifically targeted AIMCO, the investor. And it spoke to the contradictions, and you can see in this quote here, between AIMCO's responsible investment policy and its practice of raising rents on low-income tenants in allegedly poorly maintained buildings. There were rallies at AIMCO's office. There was a social media campaign that allowed people to click on a link and email directly AIMCO's executives. And importantly, the organizers also engaged unions whose beneficiaries contributed to the plans that are managed by AIMCO. AIMCO responded, initially stating that its properties were managed to the highest standard, but later it negotiated with tenants and settled on a reduction of rent increase, a commitment to complete maintenance in these buildings, and also the establishment of a new fund for tenants on income assistance so that they could apply to reduce their rent further. So this is kind of the classic narrative around the financialization of housing that we tend to see, but something we explore in our paper is the complexities around new purpose-built rentals, or the new buildings that some investors are starting to build to meet housing demand. And again, we go into much more detail in the discussion paper, but I'm going to step back and I'm going to summarize a really complex piece of history in literally 30 seconds to say that a big reason why institutional allocations to residential real estate are growing in Canada is because the federal government withdrew from its role at providing non-market housing in the early 90s. And around the same time, there were a bunch of other factors that helped deepen kind of the financialization trend. And these include the securitization of mortgages, rent control deregulation, which our speakers mentioned, low vacancy rates, and all of this in a general low interest environment. So the result of this confluence of factors is that there have been less units renting affordably for decades now. Residential real estate is defensive. It's considered to be counter-cyclical, and right now valuations are literally through the roof. So in addition to acquiring existing buildings, some institutional investors are joining traditional developers in building new purpose-built rentals, and sometimes taking advantage of various types of government incentives and financing in order to do so. But the question is whether these units are actually affordable. And by affordable, I mean the CMHC definition of affordable being 30% of a household's pre-tax income. Researchers Steve Pomeroy and Duncan McLennan have done a lot of work on this, and they found that overall new purpose-built rentals are renting at prices that are over 170% of average market rents. So of course this leads to friction. There's a shortage of supply and new units are needed, but the market is set up in a way that puts the onus on and incentivizes investors to build, but then the conditions and government support are not in place to ensure that these new builds are actually affordable. And so where we live in Vancouver, this is a huge issue, and it's created risks for investors because several developments have been significantly altered or canceled for reasons that include scrutiny around the lack of affordable units. Again, more detail in the report. In the past, traditionally, developers have been hit with the backlash when buildings don't go ahead. But now with REITs and pension funds and other institutional investors getting involved in the market, the backlash is expanding. And a case in point is the so-called Broadway and Commercial proposed development, which is a development that's being proposed on top of a site of a Safeway building in Vancouver. Local residents have formed a group called No Mega Towers at Safeway. This is a picture I took on my dog walk. The signs are all over my neighborhood. And they're highlighting that only 37 out of 687 units are affordable for so-called moderate income earners. So this issue, it's happening all over the country. And it's reputational and it's an operational risk, but it also relates back to the systemic risks around inequality that I touched on earlier. And so a real discussion is to be had here around what it means to invest responsibly in affordable housing in this context. So by now you've been sitting through a description of the problem for almost an hour. What I want to do for those of you who sit on fund governance boards or who are staffers or some kind of fiduciary, I want to talk about what kind of courses of action we propose. And this work is very much at its inception. This was a pilot project, this paper, and so we hope to be able to deepen our analysis around this. So first of all, governance. Your fund probably has a responsible investment or ESG policy in place. You can build affordability criteria into that policy framework, be it an overall responsible investment policy or an asset class specific policy. And here's Calstrs' new real estate policy. Calstrs is one of the biggest pension funds in the world. And it says that for investments in which it has a controlling interest, it will not invest in strategies that are intended to capitalize on the displacement of low-income households. So we know that these policies are footholds for staff and fiduciaries in bringing the practice of responsible investment to life. Secondly, there's lots that can be done around asset allocation. There's examples of funds that are directly investing in affordable housing, sometimes in the impact investment space. And one of the examples that we profile in our report is Newmarket Funds, which is an impact investment firm. And they run an affordable housing fund, a rental housing fund that aims to bring affordable multifamily rental stock to Canadian cities. And amongst the examples we looked at, Newmarket was unique in that it works exclusively with community-based housing providers. It ensures that the rental housing it provides is affordable to households earning 80% or less of the area's median income. And it will only exit to community-based ownership, so not for profits, co-ops, or government. This is one example. There's many other creative examples in terms of asset allocation. And last, but certainly not least, there's active ownership, the stewardship of your investments. There's opportunities for investors to bring affordability criteria into the selection and monitoring of their real estate asset managers. We work with funds all the time who engage their managers on environmental and labor criteria in their real estate portfolios. Housing affordability actually appears in the GRESB benchmarks, and for those of you who are interested, this is also detailed or outlined in the report. So there's a foothold there for you to use in terms of asset manager monitoring. As well, you can engage your portfolio companies, including REITs, in practices that exacerbate unaffordability. And so that's something that Anthony and Cher does really well, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. And last but not least, investors participate in policy engagement and advocacy all the time. A strong investor voice in discussions related to housing affordability, such as the taxation of REITs, which Alejandra spoke to, are important in sustaining other efforts and pushing for the type of progressive policy changes that may mitigate systemic risk. So I'm going to leave it there because that's been a lot of talking, and I'm looking forward to people's questions.
That's really great. I think we've got a nice chunk of time now for some discussion among the panel and for some audience questions. So there's already some active discussion in the chat, which is great too. So I want to come back first at this point to Leilani, because I think actually some of Tamara's comments really set up this question I was going to ask you before as well, which is that one of the sort of opportunities or pathways that is described in the paper is around how investors can mitigate some of these negative effects in their portfolios. And one of those actions is to review portfolios and align policies and fund allocation with UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which of course, from your UN time, I'm sure is like second language to you, and certainly for many of the investors who are here, that's a pretty common language. So in particular, I think we reference SDG 11, make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So from your perspective, is there, or what is the positive role that investors in private institutional capital can play at this scale in housing? Like, is there a way to align their work with the SDGs?
Yeah, and I get asked this question a lot. Isn't the financialization of housing contrary to the right to housing? And my answer is always the same. In its current form, yes, it is inconsistent. That the way Martine described it, the way Alejandra described it, the way Tamara described it, it is inconsistent in this form with human rights and the right to housing, and therefore the SDGs, which are based very much in human rights. But could something be done to get them in better aligned with the SDGs and human rights? And the answer is, I believe it can happen. And one of the things we have to grapple with, and I have to be very practical in my work, we're seeing that unfortunately institutional money is still around, and smaller actors don't have the liquidity, especially in this COVID era. We saw the shopping spree they went on. Martine showed 2020, the big black line, that was a shopping spree that institutional investors went on, and they have money. And if you look at what's happening in the UK, John Lewis is a department store, yeah? John Lewis wants to get in the business of housing, and they're saying, look, and I have some, it resonates with me a little bit. They're like, look, we're solid here, right? We're solid. So if it's true, and if you look at developing countries, they can't do this on their own. They're going to need privates. They're going to need investment. So if that's true, then the investor community has to take seriously what it means to be in the business of a human right. And that means, in my opinion, getting up close and personal with what the human right to housing is, what is required of the private sector. Businesses have human rights responsibilities, investors have human rights responsibilities. There's the business and human rights guidelines. There's a whole set of guidelines under the EU framework. So what does it look like? And one of the cornerstones of the right to housing is affordability. Housing is not adequate under international human rights law if it's not affordable. And affordability is not based on what markets can bear. It's based on household incomes. So you have to ensure that your investment is actually meeting the needs of those who are in need. In this country, core housing need, I think Martine described, or someone described, maybe it was Alejandra, what core housing need is. And that's when people are paying too much of their household income on rent, 1.8 or 6 million people in this country. And so I think that it is totally possible to invest in residential real estate in a rights-friendly and compliant way. You might be looking at different returns on your investment. Yes, you might be looking at a longer term investment where your returns are really healthy returns by normal standards, not by Uber post-global financial crisis standards, but normal standards over a 20-year period, over a 25-year period. And I think there has to be a reckoning in that regard. The human right to housing is not prescriptive. So it doesn't say you can't do this, you can do this, you know, but it certainly is clear about affordability. And the other thing that Alejandra talked about, security of tenure. She talked so vividly about the fear that tenants are living in. Can you imagine fearing that you're going to be losing your home because a pension fund or someone who's invested in your housing has been pushing and raising the rent, pushing pensioners out of their own homes? And I urge you to watch the film Push, because that's very much what it's about. It's a documentary about all of this. Anyway, I've gone on too long.
Well, thank you for that, and certainly I think there's an optimistic message there, which is, you know, not that we need to fold up shop and leave. That there are things that can be done within this space that are workable. So this question I'm going to start with Tamara for this question, but I want to hear from any of the panelists who are interested in answering. So there's a comment in the chat that just said, I'm going to reframe it as a question. It just said tax REITs, I think, but which is, so frame that as a question is, should we tax REITs, or how should we fix that problem? But certainly, I think it is tempting from everything we've heard today to see a lot of this as like a public policy problem more than anything else, right? So it is tempting to say, you know, this is for governments to fix. In a lot of ways, governments have created this problem through either regulatory changes or lack thereof. So I know that certainly, you know, I don't think you believe that, Tamara. I don't think it sounds like Leilani, you believe that either, that it's only a government problem. But I'm curious to hear from others, like, why is this not just something that we should leave to politics? Why should we apply an investor approach here?
You're asking me first?
I'm asking you first.
I think, you know, I think we can have a really long political discussion on how public funding should shape the housing market in Canada or not. And I think about this pragmatically in the sense that irrespective of what we see as a broader political solution, right now, what is happening is that, and I see Steve Pomeroy is on this call, and he can really, we should bring him in at some point to talk about this more, because he's done a lot of research on this. But the way the Canada, the CMHC, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, has structured its program to incentivize the construction of rental housing, it relies on the private sector. Like right now, this is just what's happening, is investors are being asked to provide housing. Investors own stock. Sometimes it's REITs, sometimes it's pension plans. And it's, you know, the pragmatics of the situation are such that we are just dealing with private capital. And the investors on this call, if you know, they've joined this call because they're interested in responsible investment. So if you're starting from that standpoint, then how do you navigate the space? So I think for our work here at Share, I don't know if this answers your question, but that's really what the focus is. I think anytime that we ask investors to do anything at all, we're aware of the fact that we're filling in a space that's not being taken up by appropriate government policy, be it on climate, be it on labor, any of these issues. I think you can make the argument to say that, well, this shouldn't be up to investors. They should be held to a higher standard. And sure, you can say, of course, that's true, but that doesn't take away from the fact that right now Acorn is getting calls from tenants who are living in these REITs, or that, you know, we're speaking with pension funds who say, hey, I do own real estate and I'm trying to make the best decisions that I can, but you know, I have a duty to my beneficiaries. And so how do I navigate this? So I think, yeah, the pragmatics of the situation are such that investors are being called upon to to manage the risks that residential real estate brings in a way that's responsible and thoughtful.
It's like a yes and, right? There is clearly a government role there, but we can't just leave it up to others. Do other panelists want to add on to that topic? Martine, you've got your mic off or mic on.
Sure. Yeah, tax REITs. Yes, I think it's a great idea. I mean, tax breaks for REITs that allow them to be effective for investors are a subsidy for firms that are providing no social purpose. In fact, what they're doing is making housing less affordable in Canada. This is the goal of these firms, REITs and others. And so we should do everything we can to stop subsidizing them, whether it's through tax policy or whether it's through like Canada's National Housing Strategy programs, whether it's through preferred financing rates from Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. But at the same time, I will say that there's limitations to this type of thing. It's like a whack-a-mole thing. So if you change the tax exemption for REITs, then those firms will just restructure into a different type of entity that does the same thing. This happened with seniors housing when it was removed from the category of like tax exempt REITs. All those firms are just now restructured no longer as REITs and are doing the same things that they were doing before. So there is an important role for governments to make sure that their policies are promoting the types of goals, the social goals that we might have for housing. I think that, I mean, Alejandra mentioned this, but we need much stronger tenant protections. So really actually strong rent control policies that prevent people from getting kicked out of their homes, that cut off the ability to create these extravagant rent increases that are at the basis of the business strategies for these firms. What governments should be doing is preventing these business strategies from working because they created the opportunity in the first place by deregulating rent protections and by cutting affordable housing programs, withdrawing from social housing production in the first place and creating this housing crisis. At the same time, I think that we can't just say, I mean, to echo what Tamara was saying, we can't just say this is something that governments need to deal with. This is a super important issue for investors. Everybody has to get involved in addressing this issue where we can. And I think for investors, if you're investing in multifamily real estate, the returns that you're getting aren't created from magic. They were created from the strategies that we described. There's just no way around it. You can't take buildings and make them more profitably unless you're squeezing money from the people that live in those. And that is a social justice issue. And again, to quote Alejandra, it's a moral issue. And I think it also, as Tamara has pointed out, it's an issue that comes with financial risk and it comes with reputational risk. And increasingly, we're understanding how this is contravening like human rights law, right? As Leilani has pointed out in her work. And so these are all the types of things that there's so many reasons I think investors should be considering. How do we divest from these types of firms in the same way that firms have divested from Geo Group, for example, that was building those institutions for jails for children on the southern border during President Trump's administration, or how we've seen divestment from dirty climate change, fossil fuel companies and blood diamonds and this type of thing. Housing is in this same category in terms of its human rights issues and extractive nature.
So we've got some clear idea of some of the risks there. Or Alejandra, go ahead. Do you want to add on to that?
Thank you. Yes, I'm totally agree with all the panelists. And but something that I think is something that we didn't mention, or I didn't mention from ACOR, that we have been telling the government, is that the Canadian Mortgage and Association Corporation need to stop to finance these REITs. This will be helpful as well, because I think so, as Martin was saying, it's not only the government who has the responsibility. I think so everybody here has a responsibility, meaning government, investors, the community, to raise a voice, the investors to really be responsible in which and how they invest in the government to shape the policies. And yes, we will love to see the REITs being taxed. I think so. I come from a country where nobody was taxed, or was like tax was very minimum, but you see a lot of problems in the country. So, but when we tax, and we see and we use the revenue for what we need to use it, well, we see wonders.
Yeah, and so I think we've kind of touched on, you know, that one particular question of, you know, is the tax solution the only solution there, and also a broader, pretty broader view of the fact that there's like a whack-a-mole piece here. So generally, regulation and policy action is needed, and I just want to point out that that is one of the actions that is laid out in the discussion paper that was released earlier today. So in those 5 sort of strategies that are set out there, one of them is policy advocacy, and of course that is a key part of a lot of responsible investment work that we at Share do, and that many of the folks on the call do as well. And so that should include support for many of the kinds of policy reforms that have been touched on today. Another one around asset allocation and governance, I think, gets at some of what Martine mentioned there, around, you know, to what extent should these be in your portfolio, and what are the reasonable returns, and how we can do that in a responsible way. There has been a question in the chat here about single family. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about any of the differences that you might see further between multifamily housing and single family housing, if anybody wants to get in on that question. I also wanted to just point out one more piece here, which is in one of your slides tomorrow, you showed some information about the Parkdale rent strike. And I don't think you said, or you didn't hammer it home, the fact that the tenants in Parkdale won that strike. I mean, to the extent win these things, the landlord backed down, and that was in part, and you know, one of the contributing factors there was probably the main one was certainly the activism and organizing of tenants and tenant allies on the ground here in Parkdale and elsewhere in Canada. But another was the fact that the pension plan, I think, felt some pressure there as well. So that's just a really important case study to come back to. Was, you know, that's what reputational risk looks like, and that's what winning looks like as well. You know, they canceled those rent increases. So does anybody want to speak to any of the differences between single family? I know there's been some recent media coverage in the US about investment in single family homes by large investors. If anybody wants to pick that one up.
I don't know if I want to pick up the differences per se, but to say that it is a real threat. That's actually how this originated in the US after the global financial crisis, was actually targeting. I mean, it's so, when you think about it this way, it's so sinister. The targeting of single family homes where the homes had fallen into foreclosure because of predatory lending, and banks wanting to get those foreclosed homes off their books and needing a bailout, and who had the money to bail them out but private equity. And in one full swoop, for example, Blackstone, the largest residential real estate private equity firm in the world, purchased something like 45,000 or 50,000 single family homes, and then did some cosmetic upgrades, sometimes other upgrades, and then rented them back to the very people who had lost those homes at exorbitant rates. And then they follow the same business model, which is to push up the rents. We haven't really talked about how this is, or not so much, I don't think, like how this is all happening on stock markets, right? And there are shareholders. So you can be a shareholder in Vancouver and you're technically you own some building out in Toronto or maybe in Singapore or wherever. So, what is so scary to me is that I'm watching unfold in the US is the purchasing by private equity of manufactured and mobile homes, which in the US is tantamount to the purchasing of social housing, because they don't have social housing in the US anymore. There's only 2 states that still have social housing, or public housing, they call it. And so again, I mean, it's just the same phenomenon over and over, which is just predatory or I mean, there's a reason some of this is called vulture funds, right? There is a slightly vulture aspect to it. And my sense is that a lot of investors don't even know that that's what's happening with their investments, where they've handed their money over to an asset management firm, for example. You don't always know exactly where your money is landing. And I just want to, I see Tamara's hand is up, so, and so is Martine's, but I just want to add, just say one more thing about the idea of, you know, do investors want to invest in this area? And when they, like, why should investors care? And I think investors generally do care about social things. And I think Alejandra so aptly described the misery this business model through investment is causing. It's not making happy places and happy people. And I mean, this may seem simple-minded, but really my work is about trying to create happier societies, more calm, peaceful, equal, cohesive societies. And investment into residential real estate right now is creating the exact opposite thing. It is a driver of gross inequality.
Great. So we'll go to Martine and then to Tamara. I just want to point out that that asset manager oversight and making sure you have that clear understanding of what's in there is, again, one of the actions that are sort of identified here and a piece of the work that's possible. So Martine, I'll hand it to you for this question.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the single family rental piece a little bit and expand on what Leilani has mentioned. So this got a big amount of attention in the media a few months back when a firm called Core Developments announced their plans to acquire 400 single family homes in Canada, and I think maybe split them up and turn them into 800 single family rentals. That's the first we've really seen of that, other than there was one other REIT called Central Condominium REIT that was acquiring condo units. Same idea, they're single family rentals, but in a multifamily property. And so this really is building on what we've already seen. Leilani mentioned that we have I think 1/5 of homes that were purchased were bought by investors. So we're already seeing how single family housing is treated as an investment. And what this Core Developments was doing was just bringing this institutional model, this financialized approach that we've seen in other housing asset classes. I think this is super important and something to worry about. And what I liked about it was that people were really upset at the idea of homes being treated as financial investments. The media went wild with this story. I mean, every single media outlet in Canada was talking about it because people were so upset by this idea. One thing that I want to say, this is 400 houses. You know, Starlight Investment owns 60,000 units. Financial firms own over 330,000 units. That's just the biggest ones, right? So if people find this concept of a financial firm buying up single family houses as objectionable, look at what's happening in multifamily. It's exactly the same. And we see the strategies that are being used there, and they're harmful. And then I just wanted to also point out that the manufactured home communities, sometimes called trailer parks that Leilani just mentioned, this type of investment is big in Canada too. So for those that are investing in various types of funds, you might be interested to know that, for example, RealStar has investment funds in manufactured housing communities, as does Cap REIT. They own thousands and thousands of those pads and are consolidating ownership of those. So does Killam REIT, so does BCI, and I can't tell if I'm forgetting any from the paper that I wrote about this, but it's just to say that we're seeing the financialization of so many of these asset classes in Canada too, and it's a problem.
Thank you. And I think that probably underscores a little bit the fact that this is not necessarily like a major urban center problem. I'm just making some guesses about where those trailer parks tend to be, that it's not like super concentrated in the city of Toronto and urban Vancouver.
No, and I apologize for jumping back in, but I'll just say this trend that I'm describing of the financialization of multifamily is happening across Canada and in the smallest communities you could picture. So you have one financial firm that owns, I think, 80 5% of all housing in, I think, Yellowknife and 74% in Nunavut. Those, I might have those mixed up, but those are the figures. So that's a vast type of monopoly that you see in these tiny, tiny communities and little towns and cities all over the country. We're seeing finance creeping in and capitalizing on people's housing.
Thanks. Tamara?
Just really, really quickly, I wanted to add that in our research, Gabriella and our research assistant, looked at Canadian pension plans and large investors and how they're allocating to multifamily. And most of the large pension funds are actually investing in the United States and other jurisdictions insofar as direct investment is concerned. We haven't done a full research, but the little bit we've done would indicate or would suggest that that's the trend. So Core Group coming to Canada and applying this model here is fairly new. I also wanted to just emphasize that there's a real difference in terms of the business strategies that are associated with what's broadly described as core strategies, where an investor is looking for what they would call a stabilized asset to just generate income, a steady state of revenue, and then the value add and the opportunistic strategies, which I feel is most of what we've described today, where an investor will try to reposition an asset, which translates really into tenant turnover, since tenants provide the source of income in that model. So there are concerns around financialization, affordability, and core investment strategies that I would suggest that there we would look at stewardship with a slightly different lens.
I think that's a crucial piece, especially as we start talking about, you know, what's a reasonable return and what's an extractive way of being a landlord. So we are getting up to our time, so I want to start to wrap things up here in the next couple of minutes. I'm just going to come back one more time to anybody on the panel who wants to answer this one, and then to Tamara one more time. So this is just I think an important point that that has been raised, and it is addressed a bit in the paper, but we've used a bunch of different terms around affordable housing, housing affordability, public housing, social housing. What do these different terms mean, and what are we actually talking about in this context? So if anybody wants to give like a very quick primer on what some of those different kind of terms are that are relevant here, because I don't think people always have the full picture in their heads of like what we actually mean when we talk about affordability. Is it whether or not somebody, you know, like two-income family can afford to live securely and not be at risk of rent eviction? Is it about, you know, low-income people? Is it about working class people? What are we actually talking about here when we talk about affordability? And I see Alejandra's hand shot up there, so give us the quick definitions.
Thank you. Well, I would like to start to speak about the concept of about affordable, because affordable means 30% of your income. This is what it means. And this is what the concept that ACORN has been pounding to the government and speaking to everybody. It should be the 30% of your income. No matter what you had, it should be your based on that. And this is very crucial because the federal government say 30% of your income. The province say 30% of your income is affordable. But here in the city, it's like whatever, they really don't have. They say 80% average market rent. But this is not helpful. So we need to get to a consensus where it's going to be 30% of your income across Canada, and it needs to be mandatory. It's because many of these things are in the paper. Like Lilana has been a champion for years about housing right. Housing is a human right, but it's in the paper, but it's not in the practice, isn't it? So same thing with the affordable housing concept. Needs to be 30% and all your income. And I think so this is what I want to say.
Thank you. Yeah, so ACORN's definition, 30% of income. And we had one more term thrown out in the chat here, which is deeply affordable. I know that's a term that the City of Toronto government uses as well. So maybe I'll just leave it there to say like that's another definitional issue that people need to pay close attention to when we're talking about these, because there's, you know, the order of words there makes a real big difference in terms of what you're getting at. Do you want to add to that? Yeah.
I'll just add, Anthony, what Alejandra said is right. Although in international law, we don't, human rights law, we don't give a percentage, because for some households, maybe 40 is okay. And in other households, it must only be 25, but generally 30%. Really the key being that rent should be tied to household income. And so then if you're investing in housing or engaged in the development of new housing, and you're thinking, well, how would that work? Well, that's where our lenders and our housing strategy, the National Housing Strategy and CMHC come into play. What should happen is a needs assessment, community by community, an audit of who is in need, what are the income brackets of the people most in need, starting with people living in homelessness, and then moving up the income scale, and making sure that new builds are proportionate to need. I see everywhere in all these cities I go to, globally and in Canada, oh, you know, all these high rises going up. It's like, well, who is this being built for? Is it addressing any need? And then occasionally there's a policy, oh, 25% will be deeply affordable or affordable, more likely affordable. And then it's 80% of market rent, as Alejandra just said. And it's like, where is this coming from? And why would 25% be applicable in Ottawa and Vancouver and Windsor and Yellowknife? What? Surely there's different needs in all those places. So I think a more needs-based approach to both investment and development and the rolling out of the National Housing Strategy is absolutely key here.
Mm-hmm.
And deeply affordable means nothing to me. I don't know what that means. I don't know why that. I sometimes will use it too. To me, it just means affordable based on household income. Social housing means something different, which is state-supported housing, and can come about in different ways through rent supplements, which a lot of people don't like, or just simply through a subsidized rent, subsidized by the state.
So lots of terminology that you know, as we get more into this, I'm sure we'll all have to make sure to be more familiar with, because again, those terms do matter. So I wanted to say thank you so much to all of our panelists today for their generous contributions and their time and all of their comments, and thanks to everybody for being here today. Just before I let everyone go, though, I want to ask you one last question, Tamara, which is, this was a discussion paper that I think is meant to kick off some further work. So if you can just tell us a bit about any next steps that are planned for share with this work.
So even though Anthony is my colleague, he actually didn't prompt me on the questions he was going to ask me ahead of time. So this is going to be off the cuff a little bit. I think, you know, at this point, we have a discussion paper which lays out the issues for investors. We have the beginning of a framework which we think will help guide investors who are interested in incorporating affordability criteria into their investments in real estate. We have a really large and sophisticated engagement program, which allows shares client funds to access engagement services. This is not a sales pitch for Anthony. It's just to say that there is engagement work that's happening that, you know, could in the future be targeted at REITs. Right now, what we don't have is clear benchmarking in terms of specific REIT practices. We don't have some of the more technical tools that would allow investors to move through this space. And but I think what we do have is the public push and momentum. And, you know, anyone who followed the very impressive and memorable federal election campaign this year would have seen that housing affordability was, you know, a top issue. Like, there is just, I think, for fiduciaries, for pension funds, for foundations, for Indigenous trusts, for religious investors, for asset managers who are managing individuals' assets, et cetera. There's so much concern and so much momentum behind finding a real solution to affordability that I think we just need to, we have the drive, and we just need to build up from there and find actionable items. And so that work is ongoing.
Thank you. And I certainly didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but action is always where I think we like to end these things, and give a pretty good summary of some of what comes next. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Thank you in particular to the Vancouver Foundation and the Catherine Donnelly Foundation for their support for this work. Cher's research paper was emailed to everybody who is registered this morning, so it will also be posted publicly in the next couple of days. And I'm sure we will be back in touch with everyone who's here today about what some of those actions and next steps are. I'm certainly looking forward to getting into the engagement end of it before too long. So that's where I'm getting started through my work at Cher. Thank you again. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much. It was awesome to meet the people that I didn't meet, and thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.